Officers stopped a man on the road and burned his vintage motorcycle, unaware that the police chief was in front of them. What started out as an ID check turned out to be a catalyst for exposing bias and impunity within the system. Subscribe to the channel, write in the comments where you watch this video from. The low rumble of the vintage motorcycle echoed along the nearly deserted highway as James Williams leaned forward, letting the cool evening wind brush against his face. He gripped the handlebars tightly, feeling the comforting vibrations of the restored engine beneath him. It wasn't just any motorcycle, it was a piece of his father's legacy, a machine he had painstakingly rebuilt over the past few years. The dark blue paint shimmered under the fading light, and the leather seat, slightly worn but polished, gave it the character of something lived in and loved. Every bolt and screw told a story, one James had preserved with pride. He let his thoughts drift as the road stretched out before him. After a grueling day at the precinct, the ride home was his escape. As the city lights faded behind him and the countryside unfolded, he finally found some solace. There was something about the rhythm of the engine, the hum beneath him, and the wind in his ears that always brought back memories of childhood rides with his father. Those rides were the foundation of his strength, the times when his father, a stern but wise man, taught him the value of perseverance and honor. The night air smelled of pine and damp earth, remnants of a recent rain still clinging to the leaves. James savored the quiet. After years of dealing with the burdens of his role as the first black police chief in the city, moments like these were rare. The weight of expectations, the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, biases he encountered, and the need to prove himself constantly to both his colleagues and his community bore down on him every day. Tonight, though, he allowed himself a brief reprieve. The road curved gently as he rode past rolling fields and darkened houses, their windows glowing faintly. His mind wandered to his father again, remembering how they would stop for ice cream after long rides, or how his dad would let him sit in front, pretending to steer the bike with small hands gripping the handlebars. The bike had been his father's pride and joy, a symbol of freedom and resilience. Restoring it had been a labor of love, a way to keep his father's spirit alive. The sudden glare of flashing red and blue lights shattered the peace. James tensed, the siren's abrupt wail cutting through the still night air. A patrol car pulled up behind him, tailgating close enough to make him uneasy. He glanced at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. There was no reason for this stop. With a controlled breath, he slowed the bike and pulled over to the shoulder, his heart pounding, though his expression remained calm. The motorcycle's engine sputtered to a halt, leaving only the unsettling hum of the patrol car's engine behind him. In the rearview mirror, he saw two officers step out of the car, their figures outlined in the red glow of the taillights. "Evening, officers," James said evenly, removing his helmet and setting it on the seat. His voice was calm but firm, a tone that had served him well over the years. The two patrolmen approached slowly, their hands resting on their gun belts. James recognized the look in their eyes, cautious, skeptical, and subtly hostile. One officer, tall with a square jaw and buzzed hair, stepped forward first, his expression hard. The other, younger and leaner, lingered a step behind, observing but ready to act. "License and registration," the older officer demanded, his tone clipped. James nodded and reached into his jacket, moving slowly to avoid any misunderstanding. He knew too well how quickly these situations could escalate. He handed over his license and registration without a word, watching the officer's reaction closely. The man glanced at the documents, then back at James, a frown forming on his face. "This your bike?" the officer asked, suspicion thick in his voice. "Yes," James replied, his tone steady. "I restored it myself." The officer snorted, a look of disbelief crossing his features. "Doesn't look like something you'd own." James clenched his jaw but kept his composure. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered such skepticism, and it wouldn't be the last. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice measured. The younger officer, shifting uncomfortably behind his partner, glanced at the license again. "Says here you're James Williams, Chief of Police?" There was a flicker of doubt in his voice, as if he was starting to piece together the situation. The older officer scoffed. "Chief of Police?" He looked James up and down, his expression a mix of disbelief and mockery. "You don't look much like a chief to me." James exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to react. "That's because I left my uniform at the station." The younger officer hesitated, his confidence faltering. "Shouldn't we just check with dispatch?" But the older officer was not interested in verifying anything. He waved off his partner, eyes narrowing on James. "What kind of chief rides around on a beat-up old bike like this?" James forced himself to stay calm, though the insult stung more than he cared to admit. "A chief who values things that matter," he said quietly, hoping to de-escalate the situation. The older officer sneered, leaning closer as if to provoke a reaction. "We've had reports of stolen bikes in the area. Yours fits the description." James could feel the situation slipping further out of control, the tension crackling in the air between them. He knew that raising his voice or demanding respect would only escalate things, and he needed to stay in control. "Then run the plates," James suggested, keeping his tone even. "You'll see it's registered to me." The older officer ignored the suggestion, taking a step back and exchanging a look with his partner. "Doesn't add up," he muttered. "You sure this isn't a stolen bike, Chief?" James knew what was happening. This wasn't about procedure, it was about power. They didn't recognize him, and that gave them a sense of control they were eager to exploit. He could see it in their postures, hear it in their voices. The younger officer shifted uneasily. "Look, maybe we should—" "No," the older one interrupted sharply. "I think we've got ourselves a situation here." James could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the familiar knot tightening in his chest. He knew how these encounters ended for too many people who looked like him, and he wasn't about to let this spiral any further. He raised his hands slightly, palms facing outward, a gesture of both calm and control. "Officers, I understand how this looks, but if you check with dispatch, you'll find out." The older officer cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Save it." He turned back toward their patrol car. "We'll see about that." The younger officer lingered for a moment, giving James a look that was almost apologetic. But he said nothing as he followed his partner, leaving James standing alone by the side of the road, the night suddenly feeling colder and more dangerous. As the patrol car's engine rumbled, James stayed perfectly still, hands at his sides. He could hear the faint buzz of dispatch on the officer's radio, but he knew better than to expect a quick resolution. This was going to be a long night. The sound of the motorcycle cooling in the night air was the only comfort he had left, and it wasn't much. The patrol car sat idling on the roadside, its flashing lights painting the surrounding landscape in bursts of red and blue. James remained by his motorcycle, his hands resting calmly at his sides. His mind was working through the situation, weighing his options. Any wrong move could turn the encounter deadly, and he wasn't about to give these officers the satisfaction of baiting him into something reckless. The younger officer returned first, his posture stiff and nervous. Dispatch confirmed. He trailed off, glancing at James, then back at his partner. He's who he says he is. The older officer, however, wasn't satisfied. A sneer curled his lips. Doesn't mean he's not up to something, he muttered. Guys like him don't just ride around on old bikes like this. James forced himself to remain calm, even as the words burned. He'd heard worse in his life, and he knew better than to take the bait. He took a slow breath, steadying himself as memories of his father flickered in his mind. A calm voice in moments of conflict always reminding him, "Hold your ground, son, but do it with dignity." "I'm not up to anything," James said quietly, his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get home." The older officer crossed his arms, leaning closer to the bike. "This thing looks stolen," he said, kicking at one of the tires with the toe of his boot. The insult felt personal, as if the officer was deliberately disrespecting the bike to provoke a reaction. James clenched his fists for a moment, but then released them, reminding himself to stay composed. The memory of his father's lessons echoed in his mind, how to withstand these kinds of situations without losing himself. But it wasn't easy. "That bike is registered to me," James repeated, his voice a little firmer now. "If you have any questions, you can call—" "I've got all the answers I need," the older officer interrupted, stepping even closer to the motorcycle. He bent down, inspecting it with a smirk. "This thing looks too good to belong to someone like you. Got some sentimental value, does it?" The question wasn't curious, it was mocking. James could feel the officer's intent, like a predator toying with its prey. "It belonged to my father," James said slowly, the words heavy with meaning. "I restored it myself." The younger officer glanced at James, something shifting in his expression, perhaps guilt or discomfort, but the older officer only chuckled, shaking his head. "Is that right?" he muttered, straightening up. "Well, let's see how much it's worth to you." Before James could react, the older officer pulled a lighter from his pocket. The metallic click echoed in the cool night air. James's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was about to happen. "Don't," James said, his voice low but urgent. The officer's grin widened. "What's the matter, Chief? Afraid you might lose something tonight?" James felt the weight of every memory tied to that bike, every ride with his father, every moment spent in the garage, carefully restoring it piece by piece. It wasn't just a machine, it was a link to his past, to his father's lessons, and to the man he had become. The officer flicked the lighter, and a small flame danced at its tip. With a cruel smile, he bent down, holding it close to the fuel line. "Don't do this," James warned, his voice thick with restrained anger. "This isn't just a bike." "Then you should have stayed off the road," the officer sneered, and with a quick motion he touched the flame to the bike's frame. The gasoline-soaked parts ignited instantly, and flames leapt along the metal and leather, devouring the bike's surface. James watched in horror, frozen as his memories went up in smoke. The fire crackled and hissed, black smoke billowing into the night sky. The younger officer stepped back, looking uneasy. "That's enough," he muttered, glancing nervously at James. "We shouldn't—" But the older officer didn't seem to care. He stood back, arms crossed, watching the flames consume the motorcycle with a satisfied expression. James felt his chest tighten as he stared at the blaze. The flames twisted and coiled like living things, burning away not just metal and leather but a lifetime of memories. He could almost hear his father's voice, muffled and distant, as if carried on the smoke. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to fight back against the injustice, but he knew that any reaction would only make things worse. The officers wanted him to lose control, to give them an excuse to arrest him, or worse. So he stood still, his fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palm so hard it hurt. The heat from the fire scorched his skin, but it was nothing compared to the pain searing through his heart. The younger officer shifted on his feet, glancing between James and the burning bike. "We should go," he said, his voice uneasy. The older officer shrugged, flicking the lighter closed. "Guess it wasn't worth much after all," he said with a grin, turning back toward the patrol car. James watched them leave, their figures illuminated by the glow of the flames. His motorcycle, a lifetime's worth of memories, lay in a charred heap on the side of the road. He stayed rooted to the spot, his mind swirling with grief and anger. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him one last time. His father's laughter, the feel of the wind on their faces, the smell of motor oil and leather. The flames were a cruel, final goodbye. When James opened his eyes, all that remained was a smoldering pile of ash and metal. The officers were gone, leaving him alone on the dark road. He stood there for a long time, watching the embers glow and die, feeling the weight of the loss settle over him. His father's bike was gone. But more than that, his dignity, his sense of justice, his belief that things could be different, had been scorched along with it. He turned away from the wreckage, his heart heavy, but his resolve hardening. The officers thought they had broken him. They thought the fire had consumed everything he valued. But they were wrong. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. With a final glance at the ashes, James pulled out his phone and dialed the number for his lieutenant. His voice was steady, though his heart burned with anger. "Lieutenant Smith," he said when the call connected, "we have a problem." James stood silently by the remains of his motorcycle, his heart weighed down by an unbearable mixture of anger, grief, and helplessness. The wreckage lay before him, charred metal and blackened leather, still releasing thin wisps of smoke into the night air. The acrid smell of burnt gasoline stung his nostrils, mingling with the heavy scent of loss. It wasn't just a motorcycle that had been destroyed. It was a part of his identity, a piece of his history, and a bridge to memories of his father. The flames might have extinguished, but the inferno within James burned hotter with each passing moment. His fists remained clenched at his sides, his nails biting into his palms, a silent testament to the battle raging inside him. It would have been so easy to give in to rage. He wanted to chase after those officers, confront them, and make them pay for what they had done, not just to his bike, but to his dignity. But his father's voice echoed in his mind, steady and calm, a reminder from the past. "Anger will only get you so far, son. Use it, but don't let it use you." For a few more moments, James remained frozen, breathing in shallow bursts, fighting to keep control. He knew he needed to move. Staying here, dwelling on the loss, wouldn't help. He took one last look at the burnt shell of the bike, a sight that would be seared into his memory forever, and turned away. The walk back to the station was long and silent, the night air cool against his skin. The hum of the occasional car passing by barely registered in his mind. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of what had just happened pressed down on his shoulders. His thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm: grief, betrayal, rage, and exhaustion. He had seen many injustices in his career, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about what those officers had done. It was about what their actions represented. They had destroyed more than a motorcycle. They had tried to strip away his pride, his authority, his very essence. and they had done it without fear, knowing they might never face consequences. As James approached the station, the familiar building loomed against the dark sky. The fluorescent lights above the entrance buzzed softly, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the concrete steps. He stood outside for a moment, gathering himself, willing his breath to steady and his hands to stop trembling. His father had taught him that strength wasn't the absence of fear or anger. It was the ability to keep moving forward despite them. With a slow, deliberate breath, James climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy doors to the station. Inside, the hum of activity paused for a brief second as officers and staff looked up, registering the sight of their chief. The younger officers exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes flickering with concern. They had never seen James like this. His usually composed expression was marred by the weight of what had just transpired. Lieutenant Smith was the first to approach, his brow furrowed with concern. "Chief, what the hell happened?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. James met Smith's gaze, his jaw tight. "Two of ours," he said simply, the words heavy with meaning. "Out on patrol tonight. They stopped me." Smith's eyes darkened. He knew what that meant. "What did they do?" James's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like a blade sharpened by anger. "They burned my bike. My father's bike." The room went quiet, the weight of James's words settling over everyone like a thick fog. The officers who were loyal to James shifted uncomfortably, their expressions hardening. They knew the kind of damage this would cause, not just to James personally, but to the entire department's integrity. Lieutenant Smith swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "We'll get them, Chief. I'll start an investigation right away." James nodded, though the anger in his chest refused to ease. "This isn't just about those two," he said quietly. "It's about what they represent. If we don't stop this now, it'll spread like wildfire." Smith gave a grim nod. "We'll handle it, sir. I'll make sure we do." The younger officers in the room, sensing the gravity of the situation, straightened up, ready for action. James could see the resolve in their eyes. They wouldn't let this slide, not on his watch. But it wasn't just about punishment. James knew that dealing with the two rogue officers was only the beginning. This incident had exposed a deeper rot within the department, a sickness that needed to be confronted head-on. Reform wouldn't be easy, it never was, but it was necessary. And James was prepared to see it through, no matter the cost. He took a deep breath, forcing the tension in his shoulders to loosen just slightly. The battle ahead would be long, but it was one he was ready to fight. His father's voice echoed in his mind once more. "Don't let them break you, son. Stand tall, always." James turned to Smith, his expression hard but focused. "We'll start with those two. Find out where they went after the stop." Smith gave a sharp nod. "I'll track them down." James paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "And Smith?" "Yes, Chief?" James's voice was low, but the determination in it was unmistakable. "This ends now, whatever it takes." Smith nodded again, the gravity of the situation clear. "We're with you, Chief. All the way." As Smith moved off to start the investigation, James took a moment to himself, standing in the center of the station, surrounded by the people he had worked so hard to lead. The road ahead would be treacherous, but he knew he wasn't alone. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the steady ticking a reminder that time was against him. But he wasn't deterred. The fire those officers had set had taken something precious from him, but it had also ignited a different kind of fire within him. He wouldn't stop until justice was served, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, powerless, or unworthy. With one last breath, James turned toward his office, ready to plan the next steps. The real fight was just beginning. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of James's office, casting long shadows across the room. James sat behind his desk, his hands steepled in front of him, deep in thought. The weight of the previous night hung heavily on his shoulders, but he had no time to wallow in grief. The charred remains of his father's motorcycle haunted him, but they also fueled his resolve. Justice would be served, not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered at the hands of those who abused their power. Lieutenant Smith entered the office, his face grim but determined. "We found them, Chief." The two officers, Miller and Jacobs, they're holed up in a motel just outside the city limits. James nodded, unsurprised. He had expected them to try to lay low for a while, perhaps even hoping the incident would blow over. But they were wrong. This wasn't something James was going to let slide. He stood up from his desk, feeling the familiar tension settle into his muscles, but this time it was different. This time, he was driven by purpose, not just anger. "Let's go," James said, grabbing his jacket. "It's time we paid them a visit." Smith followed without question. Outside the station, a few loyal officers were waiting by their cars, their expressions serious. They knew this wasn't just about a stolen bike or a personal vendetta. This was about restoring integrity to the force, about proving that no one, no matter their rank, was above the law. As they drove to the motel, James's thoughts returned to his father. His voice echoed in James's mind, a constant reminder of the lessons he had taught him. "Never let them see you broken. They'll try to break you, son, but you stand tall. You stand for something bigger than yourself." The car pulled up to the dingy motel, its neon sign flickering in the morning light. James stepped out, his gaze fixed on the room number Smith had provided. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet before the storm. This was the moment of reckoning. "How do you want to play this?" Smith asked, his hand resting on his holster. "We do it by the book," James replied. "No excuses, no shortcuts. We show them that justice still means something." Smith nodded, and they moved toward the motel room door. James motioned for the other officers to flank the entrance, ensuring no one could slip away. Then, with a firm knock, James announced their presence. "Miller, Jacobs, this is Chief Williams. Open up." There was a tense silence from inside the room, followed by the muffled sound of movement. James's hand hovered near his own holster, prepared for any scenario. He wasn't expecting this to go peacefully, but he hoped to avoid any unnecessary violence. The door creaked open, revealing Officer Jacobs, his face pale and drawn. His eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and defiance as he met James's gaze. "What do you want?" he muttered, stepping back slightly. James stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "We need to have a conversation about last night." Miller, the older officer, appeared behind Jacobs, his expression hardening when he saw James. He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway with an air of arrogance. "You really think you're going to get away with this, Chief?" James kept his composure, though every fiber of his being wanted to lash out at the man who had destroyed his father's bike. But this wasn't just about personal revenge. This was about something bigger, restoring justice and holding people accountable for their actions regardless of their position. "You're under arrest," James said evenly, "for destruction of property, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. Miller snorted. You think anyone's going to believe your word over ours? We're officers. You're just some what? James cut in, his voice sharp, the steel edge of authority slicing through Miller's smug demeanor. A black man? A man who doesn't fit your idea of what a police chief should be? Let me tell you something, Miller. I earned this position, not because of my skin color, but in spite of people like you, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else tear down what I've built. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension thick in the air. Then, with a sneer, Miller turned his back, as if dismissing the entire situation. You're not going to get away with this, he muttered, shaking his head. But James was done with words. He stepped forward, reaching for the cuffs at his belt. Turn around, Miller. You're under arrest. Jacobs, who had been silent up until this point, suddenly stepped forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. Look, Chief, he said, his voice shaky. I didn't want any part of this. It was all him. I was just following orders. James shook his head, his gaze hardening. Following orders doesn't absolve you of responsibility, Jacobs. You stood by while a crime was committed. You let this happen. You're just as guilty. Jacob's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. I'm sorry, he muttered, but the words felt empty, hollow. James moved quickly, cuffing both men with the help of Smith and the other officers. As he did, a strange sense of satisfaction settled over him, not because he was getting revenge, but because justice was being served. These men had thought they were above the law, but now they were about to learn that no one was. With the two officers secured, James took a step back, watching as they were led toward the waiting patrol cars. Miller continued to sneer, muttering under his breath, but Jacobs remained silent, his face pale and defeated. As they were placed in the back of the cars, James turned to Smith. Make sure they're processed like anyone else. No special treatment. Smith nodded. You got it, Chief. James stood for a moment, watching as the cars pulled away, the weight of the situation settling over him. The officers were arrested, but the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning of the fight. He had seen enough corruption and prejudice in his time to know that this incident was only the tip of the iceberg. If real change was going to happen, it had to start now, and it had to start from within. Back at the station, the mood was somber but focused. James stood in the briefing room, facing his team. The tension was palpable. The arrest of two fellow officers had shaken everyone. But James knew this was a necessary step, one that would ultimately make the department stronger. I won't sugarcoat this, James began, his voice steady and clear. What happened last night was unacceptable. It wasn't just about me or a motorcycle. It was about a system that allows abuse of power, that allows officers to think they can act with impunity. He paused, scanning the room, making sure to meet the eyes of each officer present. We can't let that happen. Not here. Not on my watch. I became chief because I believed in something bigger than myself. I believed in the power of justice. And justice means holding everyone accountable, no matter who they are or what uniform they wear. There was a moment of silence, then a murmur of agreement rippled through the room. James could see the resolve in the eyes of his officers. They understood the gravity of the situation. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to walk it. After the meeting, James retreated to his office, the events of the last 24 hours weighing heavily on him. The arrests, the investigation, the reforms he was planning to implement, it all felt overwhelming at times, but he knew he had to press on. His father's lessons echoed in his mind once again, grounding him. The fight for justice is never over, but that doesn't mean you stop fighting. James leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. The work ahead would be long and hard, but he was ready. The fire that had consumed his motorcycle had sparked something new in him, something that couldn't be extinguished. This was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the entire department. And James was ready to lead the way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for the next one. There's always more to uncover. And while you're here, check out our other videos. You won't want to miss them.